Hello class, and welcome to your Chapter 4 lecture, where we're going to talk about the differences in male and female offending. Our learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end you should be able to describe the social context of gender roles and delinquency, outline the various explanations for why adolescent females become involved in offending, describe a feminist theory of delinquency, identify the relationship between adolescent male and female offending, describe how gender affects the processing of adolescent females in the juvenile justice system, and identify the relationship between class and delinquency. So first we need to start off talking about social context of gender roles. So children socialize into pre-existing gender arrangements. And children have active roles in society, and therefore their gender identity is really an ongoing process. There are different vulnerabilities and protective factors that go into whether a juvenile socializes or a child socializes into a male or female role. When we look at some differences between girls and boys here, we see that when they are developing their identity, girls tend to develop their identity in relationship to others, while boys develop that in relation to the world. When we look at how individuals resolve conflict, girls tend to resolve conflict based on their relationships and how they feel about that person, whereas boys will resolve their conflicts based on rules. It doesn't matter what my relationship is with this person, this is the rule, this is how I resolve conflict. When we talk about how they focus on their self, girls have really this connectedness and interdependence where they're dependent on others, and boys are more autonomous and independent. And then when we talk about aggression, girls are typically more relationally aggressive, so it depends again a lot on that relationship. And boys just tend to simply be over aggressive, whether it doesn't depend necessarily on the relationship, just in general. So these are obviously very broad gender roles, and there's a big gap between the two, but it's saying that typically this is how girls and boys will develop into these different social contexts. So what we know through studies is that white girls actually tend to lose their self-esteem as they progress from elementary through high school, whereas African American girls actually maintain their self-esteem. We also find that in inner city African American girls, they tend to find that they had to put on this sort of tough exterior to combat victimization, especially sexual victimization, and that victimization did have a big impact on their personality and later development. Girls also tend to internalize their experiences and have higher rates of anxiety, depression, withdrawal, and eating disorders than boys do. So when we talk about these are the typical roles, there are other environmental, social, psychological, biological factors where a boy or a girl may socialize more into a role that is not biologically assigned to them. So when we talk about the female delinquent, the feminist theory starts with the assumption that juvenile females are positioned in society in such a way that simply makes them vulnerable to victimization by males. So the 2003 North Carolina Research Triangle Institute did a girls' study group, and they identified some common characteristics and risk factors for female delinquents. Those were victimization, having an unstable family life, school failure, repeated status offenses, having mental health or substance abuse problems. Those are the common characteristics, and the risk factors they found were that they experienced early puberty and physical development, they experienced sexual assault, depression, and anxiety. There was a lot of mother-daughter conflict, and also cross-gender peer influence. With that came being more influenced by romantic partners and boys. So there's 3 steps really to the way that we see females becoming involved in the juvenile justice system. The first one is victimization, which is clear. We then have substance abuse. Substance abuse is actually highly correlated with early childhood sexual victimization. And there's a link between childhood abuse and later developing alcoholism or a drug problem. And then we see acting out. This acting out can be at school, it can be acting out at home, or acting out in the form of sexual activity and law violations, or by joining a gang. These are sort of the 3 steps that a female will take into the system. This just shows you the sort of average or typical female involved in the juvenile justice system between 13 and 18 years old. They tend to experience failure academically, missing classes, and dropping out of school. Repeated victimizations, whether that's physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, and coming from backgrounds that are just unstable, whether that background includes being involved in the criminal justice system, not being connected to their family and their environment and their community, being socially isolated. They also have a history of unhealthy dependent relationships, typically with older males. I'll tell you, there was a juvenile at one point in our detention facility who had adult males coming to the detention facility asking if they could bail her out, and I believe she was 15. She also had a cell phone placed up inside of her that she was refusing to take out, and actually had to be transported to the hospital to have that safely removed. We do think that, unfortunately, that this girl had been trafficked. I'm not sure what happened with the case because it was not mine, but those are some things that we actually see in our juvenile justice system when we're talking about females and what they've been involved in. And this girl would not give us any information about who the men were, who her family was. She just was very uncooperative. And you can assume that she's experienced a lot of these points that are listed here. These individuals, or these females, tend to also have mental health issues, which includes a history of substance abuse. And they're more apt to be a member of the community of color. So what are some theories of adolescent female involvement in offending? So you have the gender neutral versus the feminist theory. So gender neutral really says that there is no difference in the pathways that males and females take to committing crime. And then you have a feminist theory, which says that gender, class, and race can all explain a woman's involvement in crime. That sexual and physical victimizations at home and their relationship to crime is impactful. And that individuals, their gender, class, and race can explain their involvement in crime more than the individual or socio-psychological explanations can explain why they decide to engage in offending. We also have gender-related biological process differences that can account for differences in things such as stress and anxiety, being diagnosed with ADD, ADHD, or conduct disorders, seeing intellectual deficits, even early puberty and maturation, or mental health issues. Now, delinquent females do tend to exhibit delinquent females exhibit psychopathology, and they tend to have things such as PTSD. They present with suicidal ideations, dissociative disorders, and even borderline personality disorders. So the female delinquents really are linked to a poor home life and a deep sense of loneliness and self-esteem. With that, there are 4 key factors contributing to female delinquency. That's being or having a uniquely dramatic biological onset of puberty, so a very early and dramatic onset of puberty, a complex identification due to competitiveness with their mother, changing their cultural position of females, and having just a hostile picture that the world paints to young girls, that the world is unsafe, you have to protect yourself, you're weaker, and you could easily be victimized. Other theories include general strain theory, which says that females experience harsh discipline, parental rejection, peer abuse, negative secondary school experiences, homelessness, and a strong need for money, which all strains the female into engaging into crime. Or blocked opportunity, which says that or assumes that females are content occupying a role that is dependent on males. and that female delinquents regard opportunities that they have as less positive than a male would. Social learning says that females are more likely to engage in delinquency if they are in fact associating with older males, mixed sex groups, or they have all male peer groups. So again, females engaging with males more, they will learn those negative behaviors from them, social learning. Social control theory says that females are less involved in delinquency because of the gender role socialization, which simply results in more social bonds. So if we go back to one of those first slides where we talked about how boys and girls socialize into those gender roles, you notice that in 3 of the 4 places for girls, it talked about relationships and the importance of that. So we just know that girls tend to socialize more than, say, boys would in that context. So social control could have an impact. And then the masculinity hypothesis, which says that females that acquire more masculine traits are then actually more likely to become delinquent. Again, continuing on, a few other theories include the power control theory, which says that girls from egalitarian families are more likely to take risks and become delinquent. And egalitarian simply means relating to or believing in the principle that all people are equal and everybody deserves equal rights and equal opportunities. Labeling theory says that some females are more delinquent than others because they've been informally labeled that way by either teachers or parents, or even formally by the juvenile justice system. The interactionist theory says that delinquency occurs through the process of role taking, where youth are going to consider perspectives of significant others. So again, if you have a female, perhaps that's involved with an older male and he's involved in criminal activity, that's a significant person to her, and she's going to consider engaging in delinquency because of her perspective of him. Then you have deterrence, rational choice, and routine activity theories, which really say that females that spend more time with peers in unstructured and unsupervised activities or time are going to have higher rates of delinquency. Again, they're not being deterred, not making rational choices, and routine activities plays into that as well. So now we get into the feminist theory. So this says that girls' victimization and the relationship of that experience and crime are largely ignored. That we don't tend to look at female victimization, or we hadn't looked at female victimization as being different than we saw males. So what we saw was really a parental insistence on arrest for females. But we also knew that female offenders are more likely victims of physical and sexual abuse, and that actually 3/4 of sexual abuse victims are in fact girls. So this is just one way that females could enter the juvenile justice system. So you see that girls are frequently victims of sexual abuse. Well, sometimes those victimizers are either their father or another adult male living in the home or who's prominent in that family, who actually might utilize then the official agencies like the court or the police to keep that victim at home. So as this female tries to run away from the home to get away from the abuse she's experiencing, she's sort of forced to survive then on the streets and might become involved in future crime or additional crime because of that. So then once she's on the streets, she tends to again become involved in criminal activity, but sometimes those criminal activities are ones that exploit their sexuality, such as prostitution and trafficking. We then have Moffat's developmental theory. So talking about life course persistence or adolescent limited offenders. Life course persistent are individuals who develop a lifelong course of delinquency or crime at an early age, where adolescent limited are saying that the majority of males begin offending during adolescence and tend to desist around the 18th birthday. But what we know is that females are more likely to be one-time offenders and much less likely to become chronic or persistent offenders. They represented 15.7% of violent offending, whereas males are 2.5 times more likely to become involved in delinquency than females. So we know that males are going to tend to fit more into the life course persistent role, and females are going to be fit in more into the adolescent limited role. Looking at a few other dimensions of females' delinquency behaviors. So while males have greater access to drugs, they use at higher rates, they actually tend to use alcohol and marijuana at the same rates. So males and females tend to use alcohol and marijuana at the same rates, even though males will have greater access to drugs and use drugs at a higher rate. Some of the consequences for females that delinquency brings along are pregnancy, fetal issues due to that drug use, being involved in gangs, a lot of theft and prostitution offenses that they would see, even overdosing or experiencing from the sexual activity getting HIV or AIDS. And there's a high percentage of street prostitutes that have been sexually abused as juveniles. We know this. Now, when we talk about violent offending, if we look at juvenile female arrests between 1992 and 2003, there was a 6.4% increase. So there was a 7% increase, however, in aggravated assault arrests and a 41% increase in simple assault arrests. So sometimes the question is, are females actually becoming more violent, or are they just coming to the attention of the criminal or the juvenile justice system more? So some of the effects that the system can have on that juvenile female offender's behaviors are things such as this relabeling or bootstrapping of status offenses and relabeling them as criminal offenses. So for example, incorrigibility would have been such a status offense, and now we're considering incorrigibility assault. There's also this rediscovery of girls' violence, which has led to an increase in arrests. So again, there was this sort of idea before that females couldn't be violent or females really didn't engage in criminal behavior, and we learned that that is actually in fact not true. So rediscovering this idea that girls can be violent just led to an increase in arrests. And then we had this upcriming of minor forms of youth violence. So things like their zero tolerance policies in a lot of schools have really increased the number of females that we've seen in the system. Now we need to talk about gender inequality. So here's a few things we have to take into consideration. Adolescent females are more likely to be referred to court for status offenses and are also treated more harshly because of sexual histories than males are. We also know that females have a greater probability of being detained and being held for longer. That when juvenile females receive punitive processing through the system, they tend to experience longer stays in detention and institutions for similar offenses that are being committed by males. That there's this sort of oppressive treatment of adolescent females hidden within the system, that many girls who are going to appear for criminal typed offenses, they were again previously classified as status offenses. So, runaway or being ordered to stay at home, they leave the home and now it's a contempt of order. There are certain provisions of the JJDP Act that permit status offenders who are in contempt of court for violating a court order to actually be placed in secure detention. So again, if that offense previously was a status offense, which typically you would not see someone placed into detention for that because it's not a criminal offense, it's a status offense. Now this contempt of order, well, now we don't know if you're going to run away. We don't know if you're going to show up for your next court hearing. We need to put you in secure detention. And police, intake, and judges tend to support this sort of sexual double standard. And this is really indicated by an increased likelihood of court referrals, increase of likelihood of being placed in detention before adjudication, and being confined in institutions. So these are some ways we've seen gender inequalities within the juvenile justice system. We also have to talk about class oppression. So we know that serious childhood or adolescent problems that are linked to poverty include things like homelessness, prostitution, unemployment, drug use, survival sex, and even criminal acts. And most urban female gang members tend to be drawn from lower income areas. So, lower adolescent females then have greater unsatisfactory school experiences. They tend to lack educational goals beyond high school, experience higher rates of physical and sexual abuse, experience pregnancy and motherhood. They have higher rates of drug and alcohol dependence, and a lot of them lack supportive home lives or some people that they can lean on for support. So, this is what we see all being linked with especially females that come from lower income areas, from poverty-stricken areas. And you can see here how all of the problems listed above, the prostitution, the survival sex, how that leads into some of the other issues that they experience down here, like higher rates of physical and sexual abuse, pregnancy, and motherhood, for example. So what are some delinquency prevention and assistance options that we have? So typically for females, they go through this cognitive transformation. So first, the female has to be open to change even happening. Then they're exposed either to what's considered a hook or a set of hooks that will help them to change. And once they're exposed to that, they then have to start envisioning a different self. They have to see themselves in a different light, in one that doesn't involve their criminal offending, their delinquent lifestyle. That has to be left behind because it no longer fits into the view they have of themselves. And then they transform by viewing that former deviant lifestyle in a new way. They're viewing that former deviant lifestyle as something that is foreign to them, that they no longer identify with. So, for example, female gang members tend to leave because they have a child, they get married, and they're parenting, and they're working. So a longitudinal study by Rebecca Katz actually showed that childhood victimization, sexual discrimination, adult racial discrimination, and domestic violence largely explained women's involvement in crime. So thinking about those things and thinking about how we could encourage those hooks or set of hooks for juveniles, for females, so that they could engage in this cognitive transformation of viewing themselves in a new light, not viewing themselves as, a minority, not viewing themselves as a victim or someone who's a victim of domestic violence or of sexual violence, as someone who can really take on a whole new life and identity for themselves. So in sum, there's been a recent focus on biopsychological vulnerability factors that are related to female offending. From a psychological viewpoint, psychiatric disorders, we have to consider psychiatric disorders and female delinquency and how those two interact with one another. We have to consider sociological factors, which are also considered and can explain much of the gender gap in delinquency. Feminist theory also argues that there's a relationship between girls' victimization experiences and delinquency. Furthermore, that males are more likely to become involved in delinquency, but females use alcohol and marijuana actually at the same rates that males do. So data doesn't really support that females are necessarily becoming more violent. It's just that there are those other reasons why they're coming to the attention more of the juvenile justice system. It's those effects of the system on female juvenile offending and behaviors. That females have been treated differently by the system and those involved as a result of society's sort of disapproval of this sexual activity and a need to sort of protect these young girls because they're seen as being so vulnerable. And then coming from a lower social class has been linked to a greater involvement in delinquency for a number of factors that we discussed. So this was your Chapter 4 lecture looking at the differences, the gender differences in offending between male and female offenders. Hope everyone has a wonderful week.